Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with part 12, across the Mesopotamian Desert of a long civilization's trail, an account of recent experiences in mystic places and strange lands by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. An article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 16, Number 2, March 1938. Along Civilization's Trail by Ralph M. Lewis, KRC. Editor's note. This is the 12th episode of a narrative by the Supreme Secretary relating the experiences he and his party had in visiting mystic shrines and places in Europe and the ancient world. Across the Mesopotamian Desert. The hour was early, the sun already uncomfortably warm, and the streets filling with garrulous Arabs when a motorbus rumbled up. This was to be our mode of transportation to distant Baghdad, the glamorous city of Arabian Nights fame. Upon a first examination, it was a typical motor coach such as one sees racing along the modern highways of the larger nations of the world. This symbol of the 20th century dampened our spirit of adventure for the moment and jarred the mental picture which we had of ourselves reliving the experiences of ancient travelers to Baghdad. A motor coach does not complement a Marco Polo mood. Frater Brauer called my attention to the exceptionally large wheels of the coach, over 4 feet in height and having tires with a peculiar lateral tread which I had never seen before. We conjectured that they were designed to afford traction in the soft sands we expected to encounter. After securing our seats and supervising the careful loading of our camera equipment, still having a few moments before departure, we carried our examination further. The windows, we now observed, were smaller than the conventional ones of other buses. Surprising was the fact that they were hermetically sealed, and we were to travel in desert heat, not a pleasant thought. Small louvers above each window afforded the only ventilation when the car was in motion. The driver and his relief assistant had not entered, so we took the opportunity of inspecting the driving and control panel. Just above the panel, and on a line with an aperture in the windshield now closed, was a metal turnbuckle mounted on a swivel and ratchet, much after the kind used as a machine gun mounting in the cockpits of military aircraft. This was ominous, and we looked at each other significantly. The thought had passed through my mind that perhaps this journey would not be so uneventful after all. We retired to our fairly comfortable individual reclining seats upon the entrance of the drivers. The drivers now received our attention. Both were obviously English. Not only was this apparent from their accent, but from their fair complexions, by contrast with the dark-skinned Syrians and Bedouins of Damascus. They were dressed in khaki shirts and shorts, exposing bare knees above woolen socks, a customary tropical attire for the British, but one which the American never quite seems to get accustomed to. They were tall, about 35 years of age, robust and deeply tanned, with eyes that squinted, the result of a continuous attempt to keep out the glare of the desert sun. Traveling slowly to avoid striking indifferent children and animals that straggled down the center of the twisted streets, we headed toward the desert. Naarne, an Englishman, so we had learned, had left the comforts and conveniences of his homeland to promote this modern transportation in a land whose history dates back to the earliest civilizations. He had become particularly impressed with the American advance in the automotive industry and had used American-built motor coaches exclusively. This coach was built in Philadelphia from his own specifications. He had been advised that attempting to operate a passenger line across this desert would be risking human lives as well as property. Marauding bands of Arabs and Bedouins would pilfer and lay to waste each caravan. He made the attempt, it is said, and found the predictions true. Unable to secure adequate protection, it was reputed, he was compelled to pay tribute to certain Bedouin chieftains who in some mysterious manner influenced the marauders to give his drivers and property immunity to attack and seizure. For the last few minutes we had been whisking through the outskirts of this ancient oasis-like city. Suddenly our speed was so quickly checked that the momentum carried us forward in our seats. Looking ahead for the cause, we saw the pavement's end. Here was no graded road or winding ruts stretching out toward the horizon, but a vast expanse of hard table surface, giving little indication, even at this close proximity to the city, of any vehicular travel. We craned our necks, looking out of either side of the coach. There was no telltale mark of our destination or direction. In a moment we were again traveling, attaining a speed of about 40 miles an hour over this open desert, heading due east. But where was the road? There were no signposts or even tire tracks. The driver caused the coach to weave from side to side occasionally to avoid depressions in the surface. The riding was not uncomfortable, in fact more comfortable than over some of the pitted streets of Damascus. Our curiosity was great, but the timidity of revealing our inexperience with this sort of travel kept us from questioning the driver at first. This, and the fact that his relief assistant had reclined his chair and from all appearances was sleeping. Turning, we looked over our fellow passengers with the intent of questioning one of them. 6 other men shared the bus with us. 4 seemed to be Syrians or possibly Arabs or Iraqians. Their faces were immobile. All were looking across the wastes, buried in abstraction. The other 2 men were Europeans. They were, in fact, Englishmen. One, we later learned, was an army officer returning from leave to a post near Baghdad, and was not a very sociable chap compared to British officers we had met in Palestine. The other young man in his 20s was bound for the wells of a British petroleum company east of Baghdad. He had made this journey before, and from him came the answers to our questions. We were navigating our way across this desert. The driver was guiding the car by compass, as a mariner does a ship at sea. These motor caravans, then, were truly ships of the desert. The Mesopotamian Desert at this point was some 600 miles wide. Unlike our deserts of North America, it was absolutely barren. No cacti, sagebrush, or even birds or reptiles were visible. Except for an occasional swell, it was as level as if graded by man. The surface was so hard that walking hardly made the impression of footprints. Unlike the Sahara, here there were no sand dunes. As the great car rolled along, now traveling nearly a mile a minute, it caused a fine dust to swirl around the windows, and we were thankful that they were sealed. Small, almost perfectly round gravel, as though shaped by hand, was scattered on the desert floor. The striking of this gravel by the fast revolving wheels caused the pieces to ricochet against the heavy window glass with startling revolver-like cracks. Just as the sameness of the scene began to become monotonous and the steady hum of the motor lulled us into drowsiness, we saw what looked to us like little dots in the distance slowly bobbing up and down. 3 or 4 minutes later and we were approaching them. It was the first of many camel caravans which we were to see on this journey. Walking in single file with their peculiar forward lurching gait were a dozen giant dromedary camels. To us they were enormous in comparison with the riding camels we had seen and used in Egypt. These were pack camels, far larger and much stronger. Lashed to their backs and suspended on either side, swayed their great cargo packs done in huge bales. Dangling from the led camel was a hand-hammered brass bell, having a clear and more melodious note than our cowbells. Immediately preceding the lead camel on a fast-trotting burro, which appeared exceptionally diminutive in contrast to the size of the camels, rode the leader of the caravan, a heavily black-bearded Arab. On one side of the line of camels rode 3 of his companions, also astride patient little burros. They were following the ancient caravan trail that had led for centuries from Damascus to Baghdad, thence to Persia and Arabia. Even today, nearly all of the freight between these cities and countries is still transported via camel caravan in the same manner as in antiquity. Camels, although considerably slower than motor trucks, are far more economical and dependable on the desert. In this great open space, there are no service stations or repair shops, and the hauling of fuel is a considerable item. The camels require little food as well as water for their journey. The products of the Western world were being carried in this primitive manner to the East in exchange for the things in which the cryptic East still excels. Each night, the cumbersome burdens are removed from the camels' backs and stacked in a large pile. The camels are sometimes tethered. Drivers pitch low tents of goat skins into which they crawl to sleep on crudely made but richly designed hand-woven rugs. As soon as the sun drops beneath the horizon, the desert begins to cool, and late at night the temperature drop is considerable. Bedouin encampments can be detected by flickering campfires. To approach them unannounced in the dark would mean death. For during the long hours of the night, some keen eyes are keeping vigil, and steady hands grasp high-calibered rifles. Even today, as in the centuries past, the law of the desert is mainly an individual interpretation of what is right, and might still rules. An unusually sharp veering of the bus from its course caused us to look ahead, and on the horizon straight before us was a dark cloud, rising from the floor of the desert to a great height and moving with rapidity in the direction we had been traveling. We were now going at nearly right angles to our previous course. The driver, whom we had finally engaged in conversation, knowing our interest, said laconically, "Dust clouds. Can we avoid them?" we asked. "These we can. We will drive around them, but it will put us about 10 miles out of our way," he replied. Here, then, was an advantage in not being obliged to travel a road or definite course. We could cruise at will in any direction without thought of roadway or embankment. When we are caught in these storms, we are sometimes forced to wait for a relief caravan to aid us. The dust, despite our precautions, chokes our motor, the driver further volunteered. For the first time, the thought of food entered our minds. I glanced at my watch, and it was nearly noon. We were not due in Baghdad, if on schedule, until tomorrow morning. Certainly food must be provided some way. How foolish not to have thought of it before. Suppose, I thought, we had been expected to bring our own. Mentally, I was reproaching myself when the bus came to a stop. The relief driver stretched, and then standing in a stooped position facing us said, "We will eat here." Freighter Brower and I looked at each other and in unison looked out of the windows at the glaring desert, white with the noonday sun, the heat radiations visibly rising. No habitation, no sign of life, no shelter, no water. Where were we going to eat? Why stop here? We were soon to learn. Lifting a trap in the door of the driver's compartment, the assistant removed a number of cardboard containers, like the commercial-size workman's lunchboxes. In fact, they were specially packed, individual lunches. This and exceedingly cold water from a refrigerator tank constituted our noon repast. When the car was not in motion, the heat became intense, as very little air entered through the louvers. We stepped out, but the sun's direct rays made the comparative cool of the car's shade welcome. We were about to climb aboard again when we heard the distant sound of a motor. Coming from the north, still several miles distant, was a dark spot. A few moments later, an open, specially built automobile came to a stop a few feet from us. It was evidently very high-powered and was armored with light steel plates. In what would be the tonneau of the car was mounted a light cannon for firing 1-pound shells. Attached to a steel plate on the back of the driver's seat was a heavy-calibre machine gun. Solemnly, the 3 occupants got out and approached the bus. Through the white dust that covered them, we recognized that they wore the French regulation army uniform. They also wore the French Legion cap, which has a heavy cloth fastened to it that drapes down over the nape of the neck and sides of the face. Removing their goggles, which made them appear grotesque, for the area around their eyes was the only portion of their faces which appeared white, they looked at each of us, then peered into the bus windows and under the coach. Without a word or further ceremony, they climbed aboard their car and roared away toward the south in a cloud of dust. They were certainly symbols of the silence of the desert. Our driver explained that they were members of the French Desert Patrol. Seeing our bus stopped and believing that it might be attacked or in some trouble, they came to investigate. Seeing no difficulty, they did not find it necessary to converse. This desert patrol is to a great extent ineffectual because there are an insufficient number of these armored cars to patrol the vast area, and travelers can be attacked, robbed and murdered, and hours, even days, pass before their remains are located. We had been riding for hours, passing only an occasional camel caravan. As it grew dusk, we saw lights far ahead. "A town," I said to Frater Brower. "Can't be," he said. His clipped sentence reminded me of the disinclination of anyone aboard the bus to converse freely. "Nothing between here and Baghdad," he continued. It was not really a town we came to, but a great desert fortress, a frontier post manned by French officers and Sinhalese troops. This mud-brick one-story building with high walls and corner watchtowers surrounding it was known as Rutba Wells. Here, in this sea of sand, was the only well of drinking water for miles around. The water had produced no natural oasis, but the white man had created one. To make the water available to caravans and the nomads of the desert, and to prevent marauders from seizing or despoiling it, the French had built this fortress. It was really a garrison in the middle of the desert. The water made it possible for French troops, before the advent of the motor car or plane, which could now bring military relief quickly, to hold out against a siege for many days. Completely surrounding the fortress, whose white walls glistened in the sun, were barbed wire entanglements, the only entrance through them being a narrow path to the heavily barricaded gates. Sentries peered down at us from the corner towers, in which we could also see menacing, rapid-firing guns. Behind the parapet of the walls within the gates was a catwalk, on which troops could stand and fire through apertures if the fortress were attacked. In the center of the enclosure was a radio shortwave antenna mast, the only means of dependable communication with the outside world. Outside of the barbed wire were sprinkled the black-skinned crude tents of the desert wanderers. They were allowed to stay as long as they desired, but were permitted to enter the enclosure only to fill their earthen vessels from the single well. An armed sentry always accompanied them and waited while they pumped the water into jug or vase. We were besieged by the vain sentries when they saw our photography equipment. We were about to photograph one when the corporal of the guard came forward and abruptly shoved away our subject and posed himself. It was his photograph which we finally took. Within the cool walls of the officers' dining quarters, we enjoyed a meal which would have done credit to prominent American hostelries. The prices were exorbitant, but considering the circumstances, we offered no complaint. Nowhere do stillness and quiet enchant, as in a desert night under a full moon. The car swept along with a steady drone, of which we finally became no longer conscious. The floor of the desert was bathed in moonlight, which looked surprisingly like a blanket of snow. The stars were so bright that many had auras which enveloped each other to cause the sky to shine with irregular luminous patches. We had left Rutba Wells several hours ago and would in a short while reach the Euphrates, one of the great twin rivers. More than alluvial soil had been swept along the Euphrates and its sister river, the Tigris. Barks of many nations had sailed down these rivers. Races had died by their sides. Civilizations had lifted their proud heads from the black mud that was regurgitated on the surrounding plain. Like two great arms, these rivers had entwined and held humanity in a protective embrace for centuries. Here, according to many archaeologists and historians, was the cradle of civilization, the site of the original Garden of Eden. The plain between the Tigris and Euphrates River, formed by the alluvial soil brought down from the north, forms the south end of a great fertile crescent which fringes the deserts. The greatest distance between the two rivers hardly exceeds 40 miles. It was not until about 2,000 years BC that this plain received the name Babylonia. Before, it was known as the Plain of Shinar. In the dim past, no one knows just when, persons of the great white race of the highlands far to the north came southward and followed these rivers to their outlet at the mouth. Perhaps they were driven southward by the descending glaciers that swept all life before them. These peoples we call the Sumerians, and they were not of the Semitic race. They were even thought by some to antedate the earliest Egyptians. Gradually they crept north again, along the banks of these twin rivers, building thriving towns and developing the land in between into a great and thriving agricultural center. We had now crossed the Euphrates. It was dawn, and we were encouraged that we were ahead of our schedule, for we had encountered no severe dust storms. The distance between here and Baghdad was but 25 miles. The Tigris and Euphrates veered sharply toward each other from this point southward. The desert was now intermittently broken by spots of green, where irrigation canals brought the life-giving water to the parched soil. Soon we began to bounce through ruts, which followed the contour of a road, and to see straggling riders on burros and camels. Baghdad was now a matter of minutes away. It is the foremost city of Mesopotamia, which name means, it is said, oil. The present population is in excess of 250,000. The city is also now the capital of Iraq, which is said to be the old name of this land, and which was restored to it after the recent World War. The ruts now gave way to a fairly well-graded but unpaved road. We came to a stop at a one-story white stucco building around which stood a number of persons dressed in Western attire. This was the end of our present desert journey. "Baghdad?" I inquired of the driver. "No," he replied, "the military airport and customs." We cleared the customs remarkably soon. Our unusual amount of camera equipment aroused considerable curiosity, but no official protest. Negotiating the rental of a small, private car of American make, we proceeded with a native driver to Baghdad, a quarter of a mile distant. Suddenly, we came upon the wide expanse of the historical Tigris River. Murky brown and fast-moving, it was a welcome sight after the long hours of the desert, especially since its shores were fringed with brilliant, refreshing green vegetation, a relief to our eyes. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.